I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. Welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. It is time for starts, sits, and sleepers for week 11 of the fantasy football season. Logan Glaser and I are going to get you ready for the week, and we're going to give you all our favorite picks for starts, sits, and sleepers. Logan, really appreciate you joining me once again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jeff. Week 11, excited to break everything down.
Yeah, it should be a good week. A lot of interesting games. Hopefully, there's some good games and some high scores. It seems like it's been a little up and down this year with the scoring. It's starting to pick up a little bit. Earlier in the season, it wasn't too good, but it seems like offenses are finally starting to hit their groove a little bit.
Yeah, when you look at these fantasy matchups, like especially when I'm looking at my scores, there are some weeks that you're looking at around 160 points scored by some teams, and then other weeks you're looking at about 100 to
Yeah,
120 with the average. So it's definitely boom or bust on a weekly basis.
definitely. It's been more the case this year than past years. I think it's been just kind of top heavy. When they score big, and the rest of them have been pretty mediocre to poor. So
Yeah,
interesting fantasy season, most definitely.
for sure.
All right, let's start. Let's get into this. Our start, sits, and sleepers. So we're going to look at each position: QB, running back, receiver, and tight end. We're going to start with QB. Who's your start for week 11?
Yeah, starting, I'm going to go with Daniel Jones. He's playing Detroit this week, so it's an absolute great matchup. Detroit ranks 32nd against the pass, so that sets Jones up really well. What surprised me with Daniel Jones is he's actually ranked 4th in the NFL in rushing yards for QBs. He's only behind Justin Fields, Lamar Jackson, and Josh Allen. He currently has 387 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns as well. That's a lot of rushing points that you can add to your QB, and absolutely love QBs that can both pass and run. So I think that's a very good dynamic, and he's going up against a very weak defense this week. So I like to start Daniel Jones this week.
Yeah, those rushing quarterbacks really help your weekly floor. And if he can get some points through the air as well, he should do really well this week. I like that call on him. My start is Aaron Rodgers. So this is a guy that actually has been pretty poor most of the year for his fantasy owners, but showed some signs of life last week, scored 23.6 fantasy points. His first 3 touchdown game of the season. This came against the Cowboys, a really good defense. It was a great showing for him. He had good rapport with rookie Christian Watson. Maybe that's something that's going to keep going forward, keep doing well for him. That would be really bode well for Rodgers, I think, because he needs that go-to target in the passing game. I love his matchup as well this week. Plays Tennessee. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, 31st overall against the pass. They allow 272.6 rushing yards per game. So if you have Rodgers, I think he's going to be a solid number 1 for week 11. All right, how about a sit for this week, Logan, at QB? Who do you got?
Yeah, sitting this week, I'm going to go with Kirk Cousins. He's playing number 6 pass defense in Dallas. I expect this kind of be a lower scoring game. Dallas has been great against the pass, as I mentioned. Number 6, we got Diggs probably going to be matched up against Jefferson, and Jefferson had that incredible catch last week. That's probably one of the best catches I've ever seen. Kept them in that game and ended up winning them that game because of that. So I'm going to go ahead and sit Kirk Cousins this week.
Yeah, that was an unbelievable catch. He has a toe injury, too. I don't know what that's all about, but he popped up on the injury report, which is a concern.
Yeah, it's sounding like he's going to play, but something to monitor for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think he'll play as well, but like you said, something to keep an eye on. My sit is Derek Carr with the Las Vegas Raiders. So every time I type in Derek Carr, I type David in. So it drives me crazy. I do it every time. I don't know why, but I do it. I did it on this, but I'm glad I said his name right. Derek Carr. That's who I'm sitting. David Carr is no longer in the NFL. All right, so Carr scored 2 touchdowns for the 2nd straight game last week. He looked pretty good, but his overall numbers still haven't been great. He's been really mediocre most of the year, underachieving in this offense. Devontae Adams is banged up now also. He has some sort of thigh injury. Carr didn't even reach 200 passing yards against the Broncos in this matchup. That's who he has this week. So I don't think it bodes well for him at all. Denver allows the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, 1st overall against the pass. Like I said, not a good matchup for Carr this week, and he struggled against Denver earlier this season. If you have better options, I would definitely look at starting them in week 11. Okay, how about a sleeper at the QB spot?
Yeah, I'm going to go opposite with you. So who's playing Las Vegas, and that's Russell Wilson. So these are completely opposite defenses. Denver's got an elite pass defense. Las Vegas does not. They currently rank 31st in the pass defense. So I like Russell Wilson to take advantage of Las Vegas's pass defense, they've looked terrible so far against multiple different quarterbacks. Matt Ryan put up 25 fantasy points against them last week. Russell Wilson has looked terrible as well to start the season. He's been very mediocre, as just like Derek Carr kind of has been, but I absolutely love any quarterback going up against Las Vegas. So I'm going to be going with Wilson as my sleeper this week.
Yeah, who would have thought you'd had Wilson as your sleeper and Daniel Jones as your start?
Yeah, who would have thought that?
The season reversed, right? Oh, well. All right. My sleeper is Jimmy Garoppolo with the San Francisco 49ers. He didn't have a passing touchdown last week, but he ran one in. He failed the top 20 fantasy points in that game, but that broke a streak of 4 straight games with at least 20 fantasy points. So he's been really good lately. He has at least 20 fantasy. I think he'll get at least 20 fantasy points this week against the Cardinals. They allow the 7th most fantasy points of quarterbacks, 17 passing touchdown as well. I think Garoppolo's a legit low-end number 1 QB in this matchup. Like I said, he's been really consistent this year. He had 4 straight games with 20 plus fantasy points before last week. That offense has a ton of weapons as well, and I think he's really going to be a good play most of the rest of the year, in my opinion. And I don't think he should really be in that sleeper category too much longer, because I think he's a real deal in that offense. Okay, let's move on to running back, Logan. Who's your start at running back?
Yeah, starting, I'm going to go with Devin Singletary. So this is where we can do our weather report. So we've got 6 feet of snow expected in Buffalo. So I personally think they might be moving this game. It's still TBD to about if they're going to play this in Buffalo. I've heard reports they might go to Detroit and play there. So definitely something to keep an eye on. The over-under set at 41 for this game currently, if it's going to be played in Buffalo. Again, 6 feet of snow. There's also going to be some winds. It's going to be a very sloppy game, and they're going to rely on the running game, especially. And I still like Buffalo in this game, and I'm going to be riding with Devin Singletary. And he's actually been getting a lot of work recently with the offense. They brought in Naheem Hines, but Hines hasn't been getting like any looks. He's had 1 or 2 receptions so far, but he's mainly been used as a punt returner, kickoff returns. So Singletary still has a hold of that backfield.
So they can't move this game. I mean, come on, they got to play this, right?
As a fan, yes. As a Josh Allen owner, I want them to move this.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
But as a fan, absolutely, you want to watch this game for sure.
They had a good college game last night. I don't know if you saw that. It was like Central Michigan, Western Michigan.
Action.
Yeah, that was exciting as well. All right, my start this week is David Montgomery. So Khalil Herbert placed on injured reserve. That leaves Montgomery as the clear number 1 back in this offense. Doesn't have to split the workload anymore. Should get a lot of carries in an offense that's really starting to hum. He hasn't done a whole lot this year, Montgomery. I realize that. But he does have double-digit fantasy points 3 games. He had a 100-yard showing in week 2. Remember, he had a great finish to last year. I don't know if you remember that, Logan, but his play during the fantasy playoffs was absolutely huge. He had a great finish to his season. So maybe he's set up for that again this year. You never know. He's definitely capable. Plays Atlanta this week, 12th most fantasy points of running backs. They gave up 232 rushing yards to the Panthers last week. That's not exactly a world-beating rushing attack either in Carolina. So I think Atlanta could really struggle this week. They've allowed at least 169 or more rushing yards, 2 of 3 games. Montgomery's really going to do well in this matchup, in my opinion. Okay, let's move on to the sits now, Logan. Who's your sit at running back?
Yeah, sitting, I'm going to go with Cordell Patterson. So what really surprised me when looking at Patterson is he only has 6 receptions on the season. That stat very much surprised me because he's kind of been labeled as a running back / wide receiver, being used in different roles, but he's only been really used as a running back out of backfield so far for Atlanta this season, and special teams, of course. But they're kind of going more into a work share. You had Tyler Algier have the bulk of the carries last week. Patterson only had 3 fantasy points, and he told Twitter I'm sorry to his fantasy owners about last week and to expect more, but just how Atlanta's been using the backfield, and Patterson with his downside with the reception so far in this season, I'm going to be sitting him this week.
Yeah, definitely a hard situation to trust going forward with the way they're rotating their backs. My sit is New York Jets running back Michael Carter. So he had a season-high in rushing yards last week, 12 carries for 76 yards and a touchdown. Actually, I should say his last time out. He had 12 carries for 76 yards and a touchdown. He's been decent much of the year. He has double-digit fantasy points 5 times, but he has been shut down rushing at times, and I think that could happen this week against the Patriots. They held him to just 7 carries for 26 yards in week 8. Patriots allow the second fewest fantasy points at running backs. New England has allowed fewer than 80 rushing yards 3 or 4 games as well. So I think the Jets are really going to struggle to run in this matchup, and I worry about Carter in week 11. Okay, let's move on to the sleeper running back. Who's your sleeper, Logan?
Yeah, sleeper, I'm going to go with Isaiah Pacheco. So he's kind of taking over that lead role in Kansas City. Last week, he had 16 rush attempts, 80-plus yards. He still only has 1 touchdown so far in the season, but he's starting to get the bulk of the carries. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, you can almost drop him, I want to say. He hasn't been getting any looks at all the past 3 weeks. He got off to that enormous start to start the season, and then ever since those first 3-4 weeks, it's all been downhill for him as he's starting to not get many looks. Isaiah Pacheco is the running back to hold in Kansas City, I think, moving forward, and I think his ceiling is going to only go up from here.
Yeah, classic sell high with Edwards-Helaire. Hopefully you guys did that out there if he was on your team. My sleeper is Melvin Gordon of the Broncos. You have Russell Wilson as a sleeper. I have Gordon. Obviously, we really like this matchup against Las Vegas. So Gordon's been getting the bulk of the work most weeks. He has 2 straight games with double-digit fantasy points as well, so it hasn't been all bad for him. I know he's been a little up and down, but he's getting the most chances. He has double-digit touches 3 straight games as well. If that happens against the Raiders, I think he's going to have a really good showing. They allow the 4th most fantasy points of running backs, and they allowed more than 200 yards rushing last week as well. So I think this is just a great matchup for all your Broncos, and Logan and I are on both Russell Wilson and Melvin Gordon. Okay, let's move on to the receiver position. Who's your start for receiver this week?
Yeah, starting, we'll go with Christian Watson. So he kind of had his breakout game last week. He had 100-plus yards, 3 touchdowns, and Rodgers really looked towards him. He had eight targets last week as well. And Green Bay desperately needs that go-to wide receiver. It's kind of been Allen Lazard so far, but I think Watson can step up in that role. I think Watson and Lazard can play evenly up at that lead role. And Rodgers has said that he wants to get Watson the ball more. So I expect this going forward to Watson to be involved, just like how he was last week.
Yeah, I definitely like Watson as well going forward. My start this week is T. Higgins with the Cincinnati Bengals. He has double-digit fantasy points all but the first game of the year. He has not been outstanding, but really consistent. Jamar Chase is still out of the lineup, so Higgins is the go-to option in this passing attack. He tied a season high in receptions his last game out with 7. I think he should get a heavy workload this week against the Pittsburgh Steelers. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points to receivers. I think Higgins is really going to have one of his better games of the season in this one. Okay, how about a sit for you?
Yeah, sitting, I'm going to go with Josh Palmer. So a lot depends on Keenan Allen and Mike Williams' injury, so it's something to keep an eye on. But both are trending towards playing this week, which would put Josh Palmer back in that wide receiver 3 role with the Chargers. And it is very hard to start a wide receiver 3 regardless of the offense. But with both of those players inserted back in the lineup, Palmer goes back to your bench, which is pretty sad because he had some great games when he was that lead wide receiver role. Last week wasn't great, but the 2 weeks beforehand, he put up 18-plus fantasy points. So I'm going to go ahead and sit Josh Palmer back on my bench this week.
My sit this week is George Pickens with the Pittsburgh Steelers. He scored his 2nd touchdown of the season last week, but that came on the ground. He has been really quiet catching the ball. He had 3 receptions for 32 yards on 7 targets. He has 3 receptions for 32 yards on 7 targets his last 2 games. He's been really kind of hard to trust, and a game against the Bengals is not a great one for them. They've been really good through the air. He had a catch for 3 yards on 3 targets against the Bengals in week 1. Cincinnati allows the 6th fewest fantasy points to receivers as well, so I think Pickens is a guy I would avoid in week 11. Okay, how about a sleeper at receiver, Logan?
Yeah, sleeper, I'm going with Kadarius Toney. So talent levels there, and the Giants just didn't use him correctly, but the Chiefs are quickly figuring out. He might be their most talented wide receiver, actually. So McCole Hardman and Juju might not play this week, also with MVS, all possibly injured wide receivers, of which Toney could step up and be the number 1 wide receiver after just 2 weeks there with the Chiefs with all these injuries happening. Last week, he had 4 receptions, 57 yards, and a touchdown. He's just an electric wide receiver. He's a guy that can make out those breakout plays, those big plays for touchdowns, and I like him as my sleeper this week.
I don't know if you watched the Kelsey Brothers podcast at all, but in that this week, Travis was on there saying he doesn't understand how the Giants let this guy go. He said he just –
And they got him for cheap, too.
Yep.
They didn't have a huge overpay for him.
Not sure what happened there, but he's a super talented guy. Hopefully he keeps it going and starts living up to his potential in Kansas City. My sleeper for this week is Darius Slayton. So he had a season high 95 yards last week, scored his second touchdown of the season. He has scores 2 of 3 games, reached double-digit fantasy points in all those games, though, even without scoring. Great matchup against Detroit, like you mentioned earlier, with your Daniel Jones pick. I think he can reach double-digit fantasy points once again this week. Detroit, 27th overall against the pass. They allow the 7th most fantasy points to receivers as well. I think Slayton's a good play in this matchup in a game that Giants should have some success throwing the ball. Let's move on to tight end now, Logan. Who's your start this week at tight end?
Yeah, starting, I'm going to go with Pat Freiermuth. So he's constantly been getting targets and yards so far in the season. What he's lacking is that touchdown. So he only has 1 touchdown on the season, but he's had 3 straight games with 7+ targets. And that's what you want out of your tight end. I absolutely love tight ends that just get targets and yards. I think the touchdowns will eventually come once they get it into the red zone. Steelers' offense has kind of struggled in that aspect so far of the season, but I like Pat Freiermuth as my starter this week.
My starter this week is George Kittle. Again, it seems like we're targeting certain games, but I like Kittle a lot. He's capable of a big game any week, despite what he did last week. He had a poor game last week, just a catch. But he had 3 straight games with at least 12 fantasy points before last week. He's been really a lot more consistent than earlier in the year, and he plays Arizona this week. They allow the most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. I think Kittle has a big bounce-back game this week and is one of the leading receivers for San Francisco in this prime matchup for him. Okay, opposite end of the spectrum. Who's your sit for the tight end spot?
Yeah, sitting, I'm going to go with Gerald Everett. So this is, again, with Keenan Allen, Mike Williams back into the lineup. Gerald Everett hasn't had a game above 12 fantasy points since week 4, and that's been without these star wide receivers back in the lineup. I think they're going to take away looks again from Everett, so I'm going to be going ahead and sitting him this week.
My sit is Kyle Pitts. It pains me to say this. I have some stock in him. I thought he was going to have a great year.
Me too.
Hasn't been very good. So last week, this was a stat that kind of blew me away. He had 2 catches on 8 targets, and 7 of the targets were considered uncatchable. So that means he caught one of the targets that was considered uncatchable. That's crazy to me. What the heck? Killing me.
He needs a new situation. That's all I got to say.
Yeah. He has just 3 games all season with double-digit fantasy points, fewer than 30 yards, all but 2 games. Plays the Bears. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points tight ends. They do well against the pass, not well against the run. So I think Atlanta's going to focus on running the ball. Pitts scares me to start. I think if you have better options, I would just go with them at this point. I think he's a boomer bust fantasy player.
The talent level's there with Pitts. It's just the situation.
Definitely.
Being used as a blocker in the QBs, but
it's a shame. All right, let's move on to sleeper tight end. Who's your sleeper for this week?
Yeah, sleeper, I'm going to go with Hayden Hurst. So Hurst has been one of the more consistent tight end options on this year. He doesn't have a very high ceiling, but he doesn't have a very low ground either. He's kind of been that consistent option. You're going to look at him at about 8 to 10 points on a fantasy week. So if you got a QB or tight end that's on a bye, you need someone to just go out there and get you 8 to 10 points. I think Hurst is the most consistent option. So I'm going to go with that as my tight end sleeper.
My tight end sleeper this week is Tyler Conklin with the New York Jets. Hard to believe, but Conklin is 6th overall in fantasy tight end scoring, and he's not even owned in a lot of the leagues. It's just kind of surprising, but I think he's going to rebound. He had just a catch for 7 yards last week, so not a good showing, kind of like George Kittle. But he's been solid most of the year. He has 4 games with double-digit fantasy points. His best game of the season came against the team he's playing this week, the Patriots. In week 8 against New England, Conklin had 6 catches for 79 yards and 2 touchdowns. Patriots have really struggled to stop the tight end much of the season. They allow the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends. So like Hayden Hurst, I think Conklin's a good plug-and-play matchup for this week if your tight end is on a bye. All right, Logan, those are our start, sits, and sleepers for week 11 of the fantasy season. Thanks a lot for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jeff. Remember, keep an eye out for the injury news and the weather this week. Weather is going to be a big one.
We're starting to get that time of year where you really do need to keep an eye on the weather, though. A lot of stuff can happen and impact those games. All right, Logan, good luck to you in all your games this week.
Hey, also, I'm playing you in the Champs League. We're both 6-4. That's a big matchup.
Yeah, my team's starting to come on in that league a little bit. I feel pretty good about it.
Yeah, we're going to be fighting for a playoff spot here.
Yeah.
Good luck.
It'll be fun. Yeah, I'm not going to wish you good luck for that. All right, Logan, thanks again for showing me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
This has been Jeff Paur with RealTime Fantasy Sports.
And this has been Logan Glaser from RealTime Fantasy Sports.
Have a great day, everyone.